land and a home where his feet could rest for good. And so we return to the question, when history overlooks those who carried its messages, what fragments of the story do we lose? By the late 15th century, the once steady rhythm of the Mali Empire's postal routes began to change. Empires are like living bodies, thriving, expanding, then eventually slowing, and the signs were visible, not in dramatic collapses, but in subtle fraying. The donkeys still trotted along the paths, but the messages they carried increasingly spoke of shifting allegiances, rival powers, and local disputes that resisted imperial arbitration. New centers of influence were rising, some to the east, various coastal kingdoms, to the west each, with its own lines of communication. Some of the old Mali relay stations found themselves repurposed for different courts, different purposes. The imperial seal still opened doors, but in some towns it no longer guaranteed the same hospitality. A messenger might now be met with polite distance, or with the quiet suggestion that the local chief answered to another authority. For the messengers who had served for decades, this was a bittersweet shift. They knew the roads better than anyone, could walk certain stretches with their eyes closed. They knew the taste of each village's water, the shade patterns under certain trees, the sound of different donkey bells along converging routes. But the road no longer led to the same political center. It branched, forked, and in some cases ended abruptly where a new border had been declared. The practical needs of the work remained unchanged. Donkeys still had to be fed. Water still had to be found. Messages still had to be protected from rain and wind. But there was less predictability. A swollen river might not be crossed at the old ford if the territory beyond was now held by a rival. A trusted family at a way station might have moved on, their home abandoned to weeds. The living map in a messenger's mind had to be redrawn, season after season. Some messengers adapted by becoming free agents, carrying letters for whoever could pay merchants, minor chiefs, even traveling scholars. Others found work entirely in trade, using their intimate knowledge of routes to move goods rather than words. A few retired to villages they had passed through countless times, where they were remembered not by name, but as the man who always came with the donkey and the pouch of letters. And yet, even as the Mali Empire's political reach receded, the idea of the postal route lingered. Local rulers saw its value. They may not have been able to match the empire's scale, but they understood the necessity of keeping paths open, wells maintained, and trusted carriers on the road. In this way, the Mali postal tradition did not vanish, but fragmented, absorbed into smaller networks that carried on in quieter form. We tend to think of infrastructure, roads, relays, messengers, as tied to the life of the state that built them. But in truth, once established, these systems have a way of outlasting their origin. A well dug for an imperial messenger might still water a farmer's donkey a century later. A path once trod by letters from Niani might carry baskets of yams to a local market long after the imperial court ceased to exist. And so, the patient donkeys of the Mali routes, whether under imperial command or in the employ of a humble trader, continued their steady work. Their pace was never hurried, but it was dependable. Generations grew up along the roads, knowing the sound of their bells, the small cloud of dust that rose from their passing, the brief exchange of greetings as the messenger walked by. In the larger history books, these routes rarely earn more than a sentence. They are overshadowed by the wealth of gold, the grandeur of kings, the famous pilgrimage of Mansa Musa. Yet, without them, the Mali Empire's administration would have been a patchwork of isolated any other letter before it, neither knowing nor caring that the authority behind the seal was fading. The messenger, too, might not have thought of it in grand terms. He had a job to do, and the sun was already low. That letter might have arrived at its destination, been read aloud, and then tucked away in a wooden chest, or left on a shelf to gather dust. No one would have marked it as the last of its kind. History rarely gives us such neat endings. More likely, the transition was gradual, the roots shifting in purpose, until no one could say exactly when the imperial network had become simply a collection of local paths. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its success, that it did not end in a moment, but bled quietly into the life of the region. Its paths still walked, its wells still used, its donkeys still carrying burdens of words and goods. When we think of empires, we often imagine their fall as a collapse. But here, along the old postal routes, the end was not a collapse, was an exhale. The dust settled back onto the road, and life went on so. As you picture those patient animals stepping along a narrow path, the jingling bell leading them forward, the horizon always a few days away, consider this. What if the most enduring legacy of the Mali Empire was not its gold or its kings, but the quiet, daily conversation it kept alive across a continent? How the Han dynasty stored grain without refrigeration, in the reign of the Han emperors. When the empire stretched from the deserts of the west to the wet farmlands of the south, grain was more than food, it was stability. It fed soldiers along distant garrisons, sustained the court in Chinan, and filled the bowls of countless farming families in villages scattered across the river valleys. But grain was also vulnerable. Insects could hollow it from the inside. Moisture could spoil it. Rodents could feast on it before a single human hand reached into the sack. And in a time before refrigeration, the challenge was simple but relentless. How to keep it safe, month after month, sometimes year after year. If you were to stand at the edge of a Han Dynasty granary complex, you might be struck first by its orderliness. Rows of raised storage and careful judgment, the kind of knowledge passed from one granary keeper to the next, more an art than a science. Granary keepers were not anonymous laborers. They were appointed officials, answerable to higher authorities for the state of their stores. Records were meticulously kept on bamboo slips or wooden tablets. How much grain came in, from which districts, and how much left. Losses to pests or spoilage were recorded too, and could lead to demotion if deemed excessive. A competent keeper was a guardian of both food and political trust. Walking through a granary during inspection, an official might pause to press his hand into a sack, feeling for warmth that could signal insect activity. He might order a jar opened so he could see whether the top layer of grain had shifted, a sign of burrowing pests beneath. He might even taste a handful, letting it rest on his tongue, not for flavor, but for dryness. If the grain seemed moist, the order would go out to dry and repack it. The logistics of moving grain in and out were no less important. Heavy sacks were carried on shoulder poles, two men balancing the weight between them, or loaded onto ox-drawn carts for longer journeys. River transport, where possible, was more efficient. Grain could be shipped in bulk on flat-bottomed boats along the empire's growing network of canals and rivers. But even water transport came with dangers: damp air, unexpected leaks, or the simple hazard of falling into the river and losing part of the cargo. And so, each link in the chain from field to drying mat, from mat to storage jar, from jar to market had to be handled with wit and wheat. In lean years, the same market would hum with anxious bargaining, and eyes would glance toward the sealed granary doors. The political implications were never far away. A wise official understood that the timely release of stored grain could calm unrest more effectively than soldiers on patrol. During the reign of Emperor Wu, for instance, the expansion of frontier wars put enormous pressure on both supply and morale. Granaries in central provinces became essential buffers, allowing grain to be sent quickly to garrisons without stripping the villages bare. In these moments, the keeper's quiet work, keeping every jar sealed, every record precise, was the unseen foundation of imperial strategy. Transporting grain out of storage was a choreography in itself. Laborers loaded sacks onto ox carts, taking care to balance the weight to avoid breaking the cart's axle on rough roads. If the journey was long, the sacks might be wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from rain. On river barges, the grain was stacked low and covered with woven reed mats, then with tarpaulin-like cloths treated with natural resins. Every handoff from storage platform to cart, from cart to boat, was a point where loss could occur, whether from spillage, pilfering, or sheer accident. And yet, for all its sophistication, the Han grain system was not immune to failure. There were years when the heavens withheld rain, when floods drowned the fields, when locusts darkened the sky and stripped every green leaf to its veins. In such years, even the best-managed granary could be emptied faster than it could be replenished. Relief grain had to be moved over longer distances, often arriving too late for some villages. For those on the edge of famine, the Empire's granaries were both a promise and a gamble. Still, the very existence of these structures marked a profound shift from earlier times. The state had taken direct responsibility for balancing plenty, Baon, scarcity, and in doing so had bound the fortunes of distant provinces together. A poor harvest in one region did not necessarily mean disaster if another province had surplus to share. It was a model that other dynasties and even other civilizations would emulate in various forms. Walking past a Han Dynasty granary, a traveler might hear little more than the rustle of Empire's borders. In certain frontier regions, the Han court used grain as a means of pacifying neighboring tribes or securing alliances. Gifts of food could soften relations, prevent raids, or encourage trade agreements. A shipment of grain, in this sense, could carry the weight of a formal treaty without a single word being written. But no system is immune to change. As the Han Dynasty aged, the granary network began to feel the strain of political instability, corruption, and shifting priorities. In some places, grain meant for relief was diverted to line the pockets of local officials. In others, lack of maintenance left storage facilities vulnerable. Roofs leaked, ventilation failed, and pests moved in unchecked. A well-built system can falter quietly at first, then rapidly, like a rope fraying before it snaps. Even so, the basic principles of Han grain storage, dryness, elevation, ventilation, careful record-keeping, did not vanish with a dynasty's fall. The successor states and later dynasties adopted and adapted them, refining the designs, experimenting with new materials, and applying the same logic to other commodities, such as salt and tea. In rural China, versions of these storage methods endured into the modern era, sometimes in the very same locations where Han granaries once stood. The enduring value of these practices lies not in their novelty, but in their steadiness. They were born of necessity, refined by experience, and passed down because they worked. The Han emperors might have seen them as tools of governance, but to the people they served, they were simply the difference between a winter endured in hunger and one endured in relative comfort. It is easy to overlook such systems in the sweep of history. Military campaigns, court intrigues, and monumental architecture all make for dramatic telling. But somewhere in the background, a man in a granary was checking the seals on clay jars, running his fingers through a measure of millet, and noting in a ledger that the stores were sound. Without that man, without that quiet room, the empire's great plans could crumble in a single bad harvest. So, as the imagined granary doors close again, the smell of grain fading into the still air, one might wonder, when we measure the strength of a civilization, should we look first to its armies, bound palaces, or to the humble storehouses by more? Bend its gold mines and trade routes, it was sustained by a quietly dependable system of message carrying that linked its cities, villages, and outposts. The capital at Niani needed news from the fringes, tax reports from river settlements, updates on caravan schedules, and even the occasional letter of poetry or philosophy sent between scholars in Timbuktu. The terrain shaped the system. Much of the land between major settlements was dry, dusty, and unpaved, though not without the occasional ribbon of lush green along the Niger River. In the rainy season, roads turned to mud, and crossing them meant a slow, methodical pace to avoid damaging the precious messages. In the dry season, the air shimmered with heat, and donkeys plodded on, their pace steady but unhurried. The postal routes followed a web of trade paths, some ancient, predating the Mali Empire itself. Relay stations were set at regular intervals where fresh donkeys, fodder, and water could be found. The keepers of these stations often doubled as messengers themselves, knowing not just the geography, but also the subtle rhythms of travel in their stretch of the route. Which wells dried first in summer, which bends in the path gathered the deepest mud, which patches of thorn scrub could snag a donkey's load. Carrying the messages themselves required a different kind of precision. Letters and documents were written in Arabic or local languages, rolled tightly and sealed in leather pouches. These were kept under cloth covers inside the donkey's saddlebag knot, because the pouch needed hiding, but because the dust could creep into every seam. In an age before waterproof inks and durable paper, protecting a document was as important as delivering it. Donkeys, for their part, were not fast, but they were ideal for the task. They could graze on sparse roadside plants, needed less water than horses, and kept their footing even on narrow, rocky trails. They also had a temperament well suited to the rhythm of the postal routes, stubborn enough to avoid overwork, but willing to maintain a steady, mile-eating walk for hours at a time. The journey along the routes was rarely dramatic. A postal carrier might pass a salt caravan heading in the opposite direction, or a small group of travelers bound for a nearby market. But days could go by with little company beyond the occasional bird or stray goat. This was not the imperial pageantry of armored couriers. This was service as background heartbeat, consistent and unremarkable until needed. Still, small human moments broke the monotony. A keeper at one station might offer a visiting carrier a bowl of thick millet porridge. Another might share a scrap of news about a distant market, or pass along a rumor, perhaps the Sultan was sending new envoys to Cairo, or a trader's ship had been lost on the Senegal River. For the messy donkeys and boiling millet, they inspected every incoming pouch for signs of damage, water stains, frayed leather, loosened ties. A small breach could mean a letter's ruin, and trust in the whole system depended on the reputation that no pouch arrived in worse condition than when it departed. In cases of visible damage, the keeper recorded the event in a station ledger, a narrow strip of palm leaf paper or parchment kept safe in a covered jar. These records served not as weapons for blame, but as an archive of the network's health. Messengers themselves were often men from families with traditions of travel. Some were traders' sons who preferred steady work to the risks of long caravans into the desert. Others had once been scribes or apprentices in towns like Genoa, but found the constancy of the road suited them better than the constant demands of a patron. Whatever their background, they carried with them not only messages, but also the habits of long-distance travel, wrapping cloths tightly against wind-blown grit, pacing their water consumption, and reading the subtle shift of the wind as a guide to weather changes. To keep boredom at bay, messengers often learned mental games. Counting the number of termite mounds between stations was one favorite. Another was memorizing lines of poetry, sometimes in Arabic, sometimes in Songhai or Mandinkan, reciting them in rhythm with the donkey's gait. Creep between cloth fibers. Messengers wrapped their heads in multiple layers, speaking little until the winds eased. Rain was no less of a challenge. It turned paths into mud and threatened the integrity of the pouches themselves. Leather swelled, strings loosened, and ink, if dampened, could blur into illegibility. In these moments, the skill of keeping the pouch dry became an art of improvised coverings and choosing the right side of the road to avoid splashes. Despite the careful systems, delays were inevitable. Sometimes a donkey went lame, and the nearest replacement might be days away. Other times a messenger fell ill and had to wait for another to take his place. When that happened, the messages waited too, resting in their pouches until they could resume their journey. There was little sense of urgency. Everyone involved knew the limits of the road. Patience was the invisible fuel that kept the system working. And yet, for all its slowness, the network connected the empire as surely as the Niger River connected its towns. From the highlands of the manned heartland to the markets of Timbuktu, a chain of dust-colored animals and soft-footed men carried the empire's words onward, mile after mile. Some messages contained nothing more than lists, grain counts, tax payments, inventories of salt blocks. Others hinted at the intellectual life of the Mali court, invitations to a scholarly debate, records of a newly acquired manuscript, or a polite query about the correct interpretation of a Quranic verse. Whatever their nature, they were carried. With the same quiet care, it leads to a question that lingers even now. How much of history rests on the patient footsteps of those who never imagined they were making it? If you stood beside a station on the Mali Empire's northern edge in the mid-14th century, you would see not just a donkey approaching, but the conclusion of a journey that may have begun hundreds of miles away. The air here would feel different, drier, harsher, with a faint tang of salt on the wind. This was the point where the southern roads met the trade arteries leading into the Sahara, and the postal pouches carried the residue of both worlds. The arrival of a pouch was rarely, would slow to a crawl, one of the least remarked, but most important aspects of the system was its role in diplomacy. Mali's rulers were in contact not only with cities within their domain, but with trading partners across the desert. Messages could carry greetings to the rulers of Tuareg confederations, terms of salt exchange, or invitations for visiting scholars. To modern ears, such details may sound unremarkable, but each letter represented hours of travel, weeks of waiting, and the combined efforts of riders, donkeys, station keepers, and scribes. The donkeys themselves were part of the diplomatic process. In an indirect way, their reliability reflected the stability of the empire. A smoothly functioning postal route, in which animals arrived in good health and messengers remained on schedule, was a subtle but powerful signal to outsiders. This was a place where order prevailed, where agreements could be trusted to endure, and yet the system had its vulnerabilities. Heavy rains could wash out stretches of road, forcing detours that added days to a journey. In dry seasons, the scarcity of water could lead to disputes between postal messengers and merchant caravans over well access. Even small-scale banditry, though rare, was a concern in isolated stretches. The Empire addressed these issues not with constant patrols. Those were too costly, but with community agreements, relying